The morning broke quietly over the village. The sound of roosters crowing in the distance blended with the faint creak of the old, sagging, thatched roof where Mrs. Hoa lived. She sighed deeply, just as she did every morning. At the break of dawn, Mrs. Hoa, now in her 60s, began her daily routine. She moved slowly, her slender frame bent slightly, preparing for another long day of selling vegetables at the market. Her face, weathered and lined with countless wrinkles, spoke of years of hardship and toil. In the worn-out baskets she carried were bundles of fresh vegetables, mustard greens, water spinach, gourds, and pumpkins, all hand-picked from the modest garden behind her house. Despite her humble means and backbreaking labor, one thing had never left Mrs. Hoa's thoughts: her missing daughter, Ngok. Ngok had been lost 30 years ago. Back then, she was just a 4-year-old girl with bright, round eyes and a radiant smile that could light up even the darkest days. Yet, those memories had grown faint with time, as if a fog had settled over them. The only tangible connection Mrs. Hoa had left was a small silver bracelet, a simple piece she had lovingly crafted with her own hands as a gift for her child. That bracelet, though insignificant to the world, was the last thread of a bond that nothing could sever. At the bustling morning market, the lively chatter of buyers and sellers filled the air. Mrs. Hoa sat in her usual spot in the corner, her thin, nimble hands carefully arranging each bundle of vegetables. Her lips curled into a polite smile as she greeted customers, but behind her kind eyes was a heavy heart burdened by longing and unanswered questions. Occasionally, she would glance at the children passing by, kids around Ngok's age when she had disappeared. Her heart would ache and her thoughts would wander. Could her daughter still be alive? Was she somewhere far away, happy and cared for? Or was she struggling just as her mother had been for so many years? The market vendors and customers had grown fond of Mrs. Ho's honesty and hard work, but many of them pitied her too. Some even grew weary of her endless hope. "Mrs. Hoa," a neighbor once said with a sympathetic shake of her head, "it's been 30 years. Why keep searching? The girl probably doesn't even remember you anymore." Mrs. Hoa simply lowered her gaze, her silence carrying a pain too deep for words. To her, Ngok was not just a daughter. She was hope itself, the very reason Mrs. Hoa found the strength to keep going each day. That morning, as the sky suddenly darkened, rain began to fall without warning. The heavy droplets pounded against the tin roofs of the market stalls, creating a rhythmic, echoing din. Mrs. Hoa hurried to gather her vegetables, shielding them from the downpour. Just then, a sleek luxury car swerved into the market, splashing muddy water everywhere. It came to a halt directly in front of Mrs. Hoa's modest stall, drenching her vegetables in the process. Startled, Mrs. Hoa instinctively pulled her conical hat over her head to shield herself from the rain. She didn't even have time to react before the car door opened. Out stepped a well-dressed woman with an air of authority and elegance. Her face was cold, her movements precise and deliberate. As Mrs. Hoa fumbled to pick up a bundle of vegetables that had fallen near the car, her trembling hands accidentally left a small scratch on its glossy exterior. The woman's voice rang out sharply, cutting through the rain. "Do you have any idea how much this car costs?" she snapped, her tone filled with irritation. Mrs. Hoa stammered, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Her voice wavered and her frail hands clutched the bundle tightly. The woman crossed her arms, her disdain evident as she looked Mrs. Hoa up and down. "Sorry isn't enough," she said coldly. "Do you think I'll just let you off because you're poor? You'll have to pay for the damage." Panicked, Mrs. Hoa reached into her small cloth pouch, her fingers trembling as she counted the few coins she had. It was barely enough for rice. "Please, ma'am," she pleaded softly. "I don't have much. It was just an accident. I beg you to understand." The woman, clearly unimpressed, was about to retort when something caught Mrs. Hoa's eye, a simple silver bracelet on the woman's wrist. It was old and worn, but unmistakably familiar. Her heart stopped. The design, though basic, was identical to the one she had made for Ngok decades ago. Mrs. Hoa froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands, still gripping the bundle of vegetables, tightened so much that her knuckles turned white. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the bracelet. Hope and disbelief collided in her chest, her voice trembling as she asked, "That bracelet, can I see it, please, just for a moment?" The woman frowned, pulling her hand back protectively. "Why are you staring at me like that? What are you talking about?" she asked, irritation mingling with confusion. "That bracelet," Mrs. Hoa whispered, her voice breaking. "Where did you get it? It looks just like—" She trailed off, overwhelmed by emotion. The woman raised an eyebrow and replied curtly, "I've had this since I was a child. It's mine. Why does it matter to you?" The word struck Mrs. Hoa like a lightning bolt. Her knees nearly buckled under the weight of realization. Could it be? Could this woman, the same one standing before her with such coldness, truly be her long-lost daughter? Memories from years ago flooded back, as vivid as the day they had happened. But how could it be possible? The thought seemed too incredible, too far-fetched to believe. The woman, unimpressed by Mrs. Ho's reaction, turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. Mrs. Hoa, paralyzed by shock, could only watch her go. Her heart ached with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. Could this stranger really be Ngok? Or was it just a cruel twist of fate, a coincidence too painful to bear? In the days that followed, Mrs. Hoa could think of nothing else. The image of the bracelet, the woman's face, and her cold voice haunted her. Despite the doubts and fears, a mother's intuition told her that this was no coincidence. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. A week later, with trembling hands and a heart full of hope, Mrs. Hoa did something she had never dared to do before. She set out to find the truth. Her journey led her to the woman's office, a place far removed from the simplicity of Mrs. Hoa's world. She stepped into the unknown, driven by a determination that only a mother's love could ignite. Mrs. Hoa learned about the mysterious woman from the market vendors. Through their gossip, she discovered that the woman was a famous businesswoman named Tuye, the owner of a large supermarket chain in the city. Despite knowing she might be looked down upon, Mrs. Hoa couldn't suppress her desire for answers. Clutching a small cloth bag containing a silver bracelet, Mrs. Hoa stood in front of the grand high-rise building. Her eyes reflected both determination and nervousness. After being led into the luxurious lobby by the security guard, she sat on a plush couch, her hands trembling slightly as they held the bag tightly. The receptionist eyed her with a mix of curiosity and disdain, likely judging her old, worn-out clothes and modest appearance. After a long wait, Tuyet finally descended the stairs. Her face was cold, and her gaze was sharp, filled with irritation as soon as she spotted Mrs. Hoa. "Why are you here?" Tuyet's tone was harsh. "I told you that the incident was an accident. I didn't demand compensation, so why are you bothering me again?" Mrs. Hoa's hand shook as she tried to stay calm. Slowly, she pulled the silver bracelet from her bag. "Miss Tuyet," she began, her voice tinged with both apology and desperation. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but this bracelet, could you tell me how you came to own it? It feels so familiar to me." Tuyet glanced at the bracelet briefly, her face momentarily softening as if she recognized it. But almost immediately, she hid her emotions and stepped back, her tone icy. "This bracelet? I've had it since I was a child. It has nothing to do with you. I don't understand why you're so interested in it." Mrs. Hoa's eyes welled up with tears. She swallowed hard before continuing. "This bracelet, I made it for my daughter 30 years ago. Can you tell me anything you remember about your family? I think you might be my daughter." The words hit Tuyet like a thunderclap. She froze for a moment, staring at Mrs. Hoa in disbelief. Then she laughed. a bitter, scornful laugh that echoed through the grand lobby. "Your daughter? You think I am your daughter? That's absurd." Tuyet's voice grew sharper. "I was raised in a wealthy family. My parents are successful, respected people. You're delusional to come here with such ridiculous claims." Her harsh words cut into Mrs. Hua's heart like knives. But Mrs. Hua didn't give up. She pleaded, her voice trembling. "I know this sounds impossible, but please, just listen to me for a moment. This bracelet belonged to my daughter, who went missing. I don't want to intrude on your life. I only want to know the truth." Tuyet's lips curled into a cold smirk. "Truth? The truth is you're just a poor vegetable seller. How could I, someone like me, possibly be your daughter?" Tuyet folded her arms, her eyes narrowing in disdain. "Stop dreaming." At that moment, a woman walked into the room. It was Mrs. Dung, Tuyet's adoptive mother. Her expression shifted as she heard the conversation, her eyes darting between Tuyet and Mrs. Hua. "Who are you?" Mrs. Dung's voice was firm but laced with unease. "And why are you saying such things to my daughter?" Mrs. Hua turned to face her, her voice shaking with emotion. "I just want to know the truth. Please, just tell me if Tuyet is adopted." Mrs. Dung's face paled, her body stiffening for a moment before she quickly regained her composure. "What nonsense are you talking about? Tuyet is my daughter. Stop making baseless accusations and leave my family alone." Her words were sharp, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Without waiting for a response, Mrs. Dung grabbed Tuyet's arm and hurried away. As they left, Mrs. Hua caught a glimpse of something in Mrs. Dung's eyes, a fleeting trace of fear, uncertainty, and perhaps guilt. It was a detail that Mrs. Hua could not ignore. That night, Mrs. Hua returned to her modest home, her heart weighed down by Tuyet's rejection and Mrs. Dung's evasive behavior. Sitting at her small table, she held the silver bracelet in her hands. Her gaze shifted to the faded photograph of her daughter on the altar. The image was worn with time, but the love it represented was as strong as ever. Tears filled her eyes, but her expression hardened with determination. "If this bracelet really belonged to my daughter, I will uncover the truth," she whispered to herself. "No matter how difficult it is, I won't give up." The events of the day left Mrs. Hua restless. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with unanswered questions. The coldness in Tuyet's voice, the fear in Mrs. Dung's eyes, and the bracelet itself, all these things were like invisible threads pulling her toward the truth. She stayed up through the night, her small oil lamp flickering as she sat, staring at the bracelet, her thoughts a whirlwind of hope and doubt. What if this bracelet isn't hers? What if I'm chasing an illusion I've clung to for 30 years? Mrs. Hoa thought, her heart heavy. But then she shook her head, determination flaring up again. Number I need to know. I have to know. The next morning, Mrs. Hua woke up early, not to sell vegetables at the market as usual, but to gather information. She approached a fruit vendor who worked near her stall and cautiously asked about Tuyet. The vendor leaned in closer, speaking in a hushed voice. "I've heard that Tuyet isn't Mrs. Dung's biological daughter. It seems she was adopted." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Mrs. Hoa's heart pounded. Could this be the lead she had been searching for? Her determination grew stronger as she resolved to dig deeper, no matter the obstacles that lay ahead. When she first heard it as a child, the information felt like a ray of light piercing through her heart. Where had Mrs. Hoa heard this news? She hurriedly asked the question, her voice trembling. "Where did you hear this, Mrs. Hoa?" "Oh, it's just a rumor I've heard. You know how it is with wealthy families. No one really knows for sure. But I did hear that Mrs. Dung, who couldn't have children for years, adopted Tuyet from an orphanage." That answer only strengthened Mrs. Hoa's determination. She recalled the years of relentless searching for her lost daughter Ngok, who had vanished without a trace. She had scoured every orphanage in the city back then, yet not a single clue had surfaced. Could it be possible that her child had been adopted shortly after her disappearance, and she hadn't known? While grappling with her thoughts, Mrs. Hua coincidentally ran into Mr. Lamb, an old friend who used to work as a security guard at the bustling Cho Lan market, the very place where Ngok had gone missing 30 years ago. Although he had retired long ago, Mrs. Hua clung to the hope that he might remember something. "Mr. Lamb, do you recall the time I lost my daughter at Cho Lan Market? I'm trying to track down some new leads. Did you happen to notice anything strange on that day?" Mr. Lamb furrowed his brow, his mind visibly working to dig up distant memories. "Ah, yes, I do remember something. That day I saw a couple at the market. They found a little girl wandering around lost. They took her with them. At the time, I assumed they brought her to the police station, but I never heard anything about it after that. Maybe they didn't hand her over to the authorities and decided to keep her." Mrs. Hoa froze, stunned. Was this the moment her daughter had been taken, and she had been completely unaware? But how could she verify something that had happened 30 years ago? Motivated by Mr. Lamb's recollection, Mrs. Hua asked for any information he might have about the couple's whereabouts. Luckily, Mr. Lamb vaguely remembered that they had lived in a small alley near the market. Wasting no time, Mrs. Hoa headed straight there. The alley was eerily quiet, but it had transformed over the decades. New houses had replaced the old ones. Mrs. Hoa knocked on doors one by one, patiently asking the residents if they knew anything about the couple. After hours of effort, an elderly woman finally remembered something. "Oh yes, there was a young couple living here long ago, but they moved away ages ago. I did hear that they adopted a little girl, but I don't know what happened after that." The trail felt like it had gone cold, and Mrs. Hoa's heart sank. Once again, it seemed she had returned to square one. Disappointment loomed, but she refused to let go of hope. "I have to keep going," she told herself. One afternoon, while quietly selling vegetables at the market, Mrs. Hua caught sight of Tuyet. The young woman was walking through the market, likely heading to meet a business partner. Their eyes accidentally met for a fleeting moment. Tuyet froze briefly as though torn, then tried to continue walking, but something made her turn back. "What do you want from me now?" Tuyet's voice was cold. "I've already told you. I have nothing to do with you." Mrs. Hoa's hands trembled as she clenched them together, trying to contain the emotion surging within her. "Tuyet, I don't mean to trouble you. I only ask for one thing. If you truly aren't my daughter, I promise I will never bother you again. But if there's even the slightest chance, please allow me to find out the truth." Tuyet stood silently, her eyes flickering with unease. Finally, she replied, "I don't know what you're thinking, but let me make one thing clear. I have no obligation to do anything for you." With that, she turned and began to walk away. But just as she was leaving, Mrs. Hua called out unexpectedly, "The silver bracelet on your wrist. I made that for my daughter with these very hands. If you don't believe me, let me prove it to you." Tuyet paused. Slowly, she turned back to look at Mrs. Hua again. This time, her gaze had softened, the coldness in her expression fading just slightly. That night, Tuyet couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. Her thoughts kept returning to Mrs. Ho's words, and the silver bracelet on her wrist seemed to feel heavier than usual. From as far back as she could remember, she had always had that bracelet. Yet her adoptive mother had never clearly explained where it had come from. The one time she had asked, Mrs. Dung simply said it was a keepsake from your early childhood. But something about that answer hadn't sat well with Tuyet. That evening, she returned home and confronted Mrs. Dung directly. "Mom, this bracelet, where did it come from? Why have you never told me anything about it?" Mrs. Dung hesitated for a split second before regaining her composure. "It's just something I found when I adopted you. It doesn't mean anything. Don't overthink it." But the response didn't ease Tuyet's mind. She sensed that her adoptive mother was hiding something. Doubts began to take root and grow, leaving her restless. Determined to uncover the truth, Tuyet decided to take matters into her own hands. She quietly visited the archives of the orphanage where she had been adopted. There, she requested to see her adoption records. After some time, the staff handed her an old file. Leafing through its worn pages, Tuyet came across a detail that stopped her cold. The record stated that she had been adopted in 1994, the same year Mrs. Hoa had lost her daughter. But what truly startled Tuyet was a small note in the file that mentioned where she had been found: Cho Lan Market. Attached to the file was a slip of paper with the name Ngoch written on it. Tuyet's hands shook as she held the paper. She had never known she had once been called by that name. Her head spun with confusion. Could Mrs. Hoa have been telling the truth all along? Could she really be Tuyet's biological mother? If so, why had life played such a cruel trick, separating them for so long? Tuyet left the orphanage deep in thought, her heart heavy. If the records were accurate, everything Mrs. Hoa had claimed was true. But if that was the case, how would she confront the reality of it? And why had Mrs. Dung kept this from her? Tuyet found herself in the same challenging situation again, facing the one question that had haunted her for years. Why did her adoptive mother, Mrs. Dung, never reveal the full truth? This time, Tuyet was determined to get the answers she desperately sought. Sitting across from her mother, she spoke with a mixture of strength and vulnerability. "Mom, I want to know the truth. I'm not your biological daughter, am I? And my name, my real name, was it Ngok when I was younger?" Mrs. Dung's expression froze for a moment, as if caught off guard. She hesitated, trying to deflect the question, but Tuyet's unwavering gaze left her no escape. After a long pause, Mrs. Dung sighed, her face revealing a deep worry she had carried for years. "You're right," she finally admitted. "You are not my biological daughter. But I didn't think you needed to know everything. I raised you for all these years. Wasn't that enough?" Her vague answer only deepened Tuyet's suspicion. A knot tightened in her chest. She decided it was time to confront another figure from her past, Mrs. Hoa, the woman whose words had planted the first seeds of doubt. Returning home that evening, Tuyet felt like her thoughts were spinning out of control. Her mind kept replaying fragments of the orphanage records she had seen, the unsettling coincidences between Mrs. Hoa's claims and the details in those files. The silver bracelet on her wrist, which she had always considered insignificant, now felt unbearably heavy. It carried a mystery she could no longer ignore. Tuyet made up her mind. She would confront the truth no matter how painful it might be, even if it meant her life would never be the same again. That night, Tuyet sat across the table from Mrs. Dung once more. Between them lay the silver bracelet, a small but powerful relic of her forgotten past. Tuyet's voice trembled slightly, but it was steady with resolve. "Mom," she began, "I already know I'm not your biological daughter, but what I don't understand is why. Why have you never told me the truth? Why did you keep my origins a secret? Why did you hide this from me?" Mrs. Dung looked visibly unsettled, avoiding Tuyet's gaze. Her hands reached for the bracelet on the table, trembling as she picked it up. For a moment there was only silence. Then with a deep breath she spoke words that seemed to weigh heavily on her soul. "Tuyet, I was always afraid this day would come. You're right, you're not my biological daughter, but I loved you as my own. I didn't want you to be hurt by knowing the truth." Tuyet clenched her fists tightly, struggling to keep her emotions under control. Her voice, though calm, carried a sense of urgency. "Mom, I understand you love me, and I love you too, but I need to know the truth. Please, just tell me everything." At last, Mrs. Dung began to recount the story she had kept hidden for 30 long years. She explained that she and her late husband, Mr. Hung, had found a lost little girl at a bustling marketplace one fateful day. The child had been crying for her mother, her tiny wrist adorned with a silver bracelet. Unable to have children of their own, they had made the life-altering decision to take the girl home and raise her as their daughter. They had never reported the situation to the authorities and had given the girl a new name, Tuyet. Hearing this, Tuyet felt her entire world collapse. Her breath caught in her throat. The silver bracelet she now wore was no longer just a meaningless trinket. It was a thread tied to the family she had never known. While she still loved Mrs. Dung deeply, Tuyet couldn't deny the ache of longing for answers about her true origins. She resolved to find the missing pieces of her story, even if it meant confronting her pride and revisiting Mrs. Hoa, a woman she had once dismissed. The next morning, Tuyet returned to the small marketplace where Mrs. Hoa sold vegetables. This time she came alone. No fancy car, no cold demeanor. She wanted this meeting to be different. Mrs. Hoa sat quietly by her stall, her weary eyes scanning the flow of people. When Tuyet appeared, Mrs. Hoa froze in disbelief, her body stiffening as if time had stopped. Tuyet approached her, bowing her head slightly before speaking, her voice filled with sincerity. "Madam, I would like to speak with you." Though her voice quivered, Tuyet's eyes shone with determination. Mrs. Hua's tears began to fall before she could respond, and she simply nodded. Together, they moved to a quieter corner of the market, away from the noise and commotion. As they sat together, Tuyet proposed something that could finally bring clarity to both their lives, a DNA test. "I don't know if you're truly my mother," Tuyet said softly, "but I think this is the only way we'll know for sure. If the result is not what you hope, I'm sorry in advance, but we need to do this." Mrs. Hoa's heart ached at the thought, but she agreed. This was her one chance to reunite with the daughter she had mourned for 3 decades. They went together to the hospital, where the test was administered. The days of waiting for the results were agonizing, especially for Mrs. Hoa. Each night she sat before her family altar, lighting incense and praying fervently through her tears. She tried to temper her hope, fearing disappointment, yet her mother's intuition told her the truth. In her heart, she felt certain Tuyet was Ngak, the daughter she had lost so many years ago. For 30 long years, she had carried that pain, and now the answers were just within reach. Snow was filled with restless thoughts. Her emotions were a tangled web of curiosity, fear, and a faint glimmer of hope. She kept asking herself, what if the test confirmed that Mrs. Hoa was her biological mother? How would her life change? Could she accept Mrs. Hoa and the truth about her past? Finally, the day of the result came. Snow and Mrs. Hoa met at the hospital where the doctor held the fateful paper in hand. With a gentle smile, the doctor looked at them and announced, "The results confirm that you are biologically related. Congratulations, Snow is indeed your daughter." Those words were like a ray of light piercing through the darkness in Mrs. Hoa's heart. Overcome with emotion, she broke into sobs, her hands trembling as she grasped Snow's. "Ngak, my daughter," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Snow, on the other hand, struggled to process the truth. She wasn't yet accustomed to this new reality, but when she looked into Mrs. Hoa's tear-filled eyes, brimming with maternal love, she felt a sacred bond she had never known. Despite the happiness of finding her birth mother, Snow couldn't shake the feeling of unease when thinking about Mrs. Dung, the adoptive mother who had raised her for 30 years. She decided it was time to confront this and share her feelings openly. That evening, Snow returned home and sat down next to Mrs. Dung. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling with emotion, "I know everything now. Mrs. Hoa is my biological mother." Mrs. Dung fell silent, her eyes welling up with tears. After a moment, she sighed softly. "I knew this day would come. I've always feared losing you, but I understand. You needed to know where you come from. Snow took Mrs. Dung's hands in hers, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mom, no matter what, you will always be my mother. I don't blame you for anything because I know you love me and have always wanted the best for me. But now, I also want to make it up to Mrs. Hua, the woman who has suffered for 30 years while searching for me." The two embraced in a heartfelt moment, tears flowing freely. It was a moment of forgiveness, understanding, and an unspoken bond that transcended the complications of truth. Snow then made a decision. She would organize a simple dinner at Mrs. Ho's home so that the two mothers could meet each other. The dinner wasn't extravagant, but it was rich with emotion. Mrs. Hoa and Mrs. Dung sat across from each other at the table. At first, their gazes held a hint of awkwardness, but gradually they softened. "I thank you for raising my daughter so well," Mrs. Hoa said, her voice choked with emotion. Mrs. Dung smiled faintly and replied, "And I thank you for bringing her into this world. Snow is the greatest gift in my life." In that moment, the two women, each holding an irreplaceable role in Snow's life, found common ground in their shared love for her. They shared the pain of separation and the joy of reunion. The sacredness of motherhood was fully revealed in the harmony of that evening. Snow now found herself in a unique position. She was both Mrs. Hoa's daughter and Mrs. Dung's daughter. She made a vow to care for both of them and to make up for the lost years. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting warm rays over Mrs. Hoa's small house. The cheerful chirping of birds filled the air, bringing life to the quiet surroundings. In the modest kitchen, Mrs. Hoa was busy preparing a special meal. Today was a day she had dreamed of but never dared to believe would come true. A day when both mothers and their daughter would sit together. As she worked, Mrs. Hoa hummed a familiar folk tune under her breath. Her thin, trembling hands carefully arranged the dishes on the small wooden table, her eyes shining with hope and joy. This was not just a reunion meal, it was also a heartfelt thank you to fate and to Mrs. Dung, who had cared for her daughter all these years. The distant sound of a car broke the morning silence. Snow and Mrs. Dung had arrived. Mrs. Hoa hurried out to the yard, her eyes glistening as she saw Snow step out of the car. Snow wore a simple dress, yet her grace and elegance radiated. Walking beside her was Mrs. Dung, the woman who had lovingly raised her for 3 decades. Snow approached Mrs. Hoa and gently held her hands. "Mom, I'm home," she said softly, her voice quivering with emotion. Mrs. Hoa couldn't contain herself. She pulled Snow into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "Ngak, my child," she whispered. "At last I can call you my daughter, fully and completely. You've come back to me." Standing nearby, Mrs. Dung smiled gently. She understood that while she had been the one to raise Snow, the bond of blood and the deep connection between Snow and Mrs. Hoa was irreplaceable. The three of them sat down around the wooden table, which held a simple yet heartfelt spread of dishes: a pot of sour soup, a plate of braised fish, steamed vegetables, and a tray of coconut-filled rice cakes that Mrs. Hoa had spent all morning preparing. Snow gazed at the food and felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity, something she had never known before. "This rice cake," Mrs. Hoa said, her voice trembling, "I used to make it for you when you were little. You loved it so much. Every time I made it, you would run around begging to eat it before it was ready." Snow picked up a piece of the cake, tears welling in her eyes. As she took the first bite, the taste unlocked something deep within her, an indescribable feeling of warmth, love, and belonging. She couldn't believe that even though her childhood memories had been lost, this taste brought them rushing back in vivid clarity. For the first time in her life, Snow felt complete. The past, with all its pain and mystery, was now woven together with the present in a beautiful tapestry of forgiveness, reconciliation, and love. This was not just a story of finding one's roots, it was a story of two mothers, bound by their love for the same daughter, finding peace with each other. And for Snow, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would nurture the bonds with both her mothers, making every moment with them count as they embraced the life they had been given to share. The taste of the dish awakened something deep within her, a connection to her biological mother that she had long buried. The dinner was filled with both laughter and tears. Tuyet shared her life story with Mrs. Hoa, recounting the ups and downs she had faced, as well as the achievements she had accomplished, all thanks to the love and upbringing she had received from Mrs. Dung. Mrs. Hoa listened intently, her eyes glimmering with pride. "My child, you've grown beyond what I could have ever hoped for," she said with a voice full of emotion. "Even though I wasn't by your side, I've always prayed for you to be safe and at peace," Mrs. Hoa added, her voice trembling. After dinner, Mrs. Dung and Mrs. Hoa sat down for a private conversation. From afar, Tuyet quietly observed the two mothers in her life. Her heart was overwhelmed with emotions, but above all, she felt an immense gratitude. Without these two women, she wouldn't have become the person she was today. Mrs. Hoa took Mrs. Dung's hands in hers, her eyes filled with deep appreciation. "Thank you for raising Tuyet into such a wonderful person," Mrs. Hoa said, her voice heavy with sincerity. "I don't know how to thank you enough. If it weren't for you, I might have lost my child forever." Mrs. Dung responded with a gentle smile. "You don't need to thank me. Tuyet is the greatest gift I've ever received. I only wish for her happiness now, for her to live a life full of love, with both of us by her side." In that moment, all barriers and past differences melted away. The conversation flowed with empathy and understanding. The two women, who had once walked different paths, now shared the same bond, their unconditional love for the same child. In the days that followed, Tuyet began spending more time with Mrs. Hoa. She visited her often, helping to repair her aging house and tending to the small vegetable garden they worked on together. On quiet afternoons, Tuyet would sit and listen as Mrs. Hoa told stories about the years she had spent searching for her daughter, or about the dreams she had of Tuyet crying and calling out for her. Gradually, Tuyet came to realize that while her two mothers were very different individuals, they loved her in equally profound ways. Mrs. Dung had taught her to be a strong, independent woman, while Mrs. Hoa was a symbol of patience and unconditional love. Inspired by her gratitude, Tuyet decided to host a special event to honor both of her mothers. The gathering was small and intimate, with just a few close neighbors from Mrs. Hoa's village. Yet it was warm and meaningful. Standing between the two women, Tuyet gave a heartfelt speech, her voice choked with tears. "Today, I want to express my deepest gratitude to both of my mothers. One gave birth to me and taught me the sacred bond of motherhood. The other raised me and showed me how to live and love. I am truly blessed to have two amazing mothers like you in my life." Neither Mrs. Hoa nor Mrs. Dung could hold back their tears. They looked at Tuyet with pride and love, feeling as though all the pain and loss they had endured in the past had finally been healed. The story reached its resolution when Tuyet decided to build a new house next to Mrs. Hoa's home. This way, she could stay close to her biological mother without leaving Mrs. Dung. She even convinced Mrs. Dung to move nearby so that the two women could support each other and remain part of Tuyet's life. One peaceful afternoon, Tuyet sat on a small chair in the front yard of Mrs. Hoa's house. The golden sunlight stretched across the fields, casting a warm glow over the scene. Beside her sat her two mothers, one mending an old piece of clothing, the other reminiscing about her youth. Tuyet smiled, feeling a sense of serenity she had never known before. "Mom, I love you both," Tuyet whispered softly, taking their hands into her own. The three of them sat there in silence, wrapped in a quiet but powerful bond of love. No words were needed. In that moment, they had everything: understanding, forgiveness, and a love that transcended all the pain and separation of the past. It was a perfect ending, a story where love, compassion, and reunion triumphed over all the trials of life.